and you're probably most familiar with the House for Artists project, which was shortlisted for Stirling and won the Neave Brown Award. It's a very interesting housing project in East London, kind of rethinking what contemporary architecture and contemporary housing might be. So I think it fits in really well with our theme of anti-apathetic architecture and kind of trying to shake the canon a little bit and talking about that in the lecture series. So pass over to Nick.
Yeah, thank you. You can see that's not too dark, is it? Okay. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Very nice to be here. I did undergraduate here at the Holloway Road building. It's nice to be back. Nice to see David, who's one of my teachers. So yeah, thank you. Great list of lectures as well. The topic, apathy. We're very interested in anti-apathy. I'm sort of intrigued by why you picked the topic. We were just discussing it earlier, Astrid and I, and there is a kind of feeling of the world is so set in place and things are so set that what can you possibly do? Particularly if you're doing design, which in terms of agency within the decision-making machine, the finance machine, is really at the bottom, right? And that's also problematic because we see, I guess, designers, many designers, particularly architects, see themselves as people who look after the creation of things for the benefit of other people, right? So, and you can question whether that's arrogant or not or something else, but if that's the role and you're at the bottom of the agency part, then it's kind of, well, what the hell am I doing? So apathy can set in quite quickly. Is that kind of what it's about? Yes. So we studied in the late noughties, early 2010s, and just at the same time as us, just before, there was a generation of people who were really interested in apathy in terms of tackling, in terms of, well, maybe the way to address it is through policy, right? So the great Finn William Puja later created this thing called public practice, which you all know, right? So private practice is part of an attempt to say, well, what the hell can designers do? Maybe we have to abandon design. Actually, to abandon design, we have to go into policy, yeah, which is a completely correct conclusion we feel, right? That's very powerful work, and it's increasing what it can actually do. Then in our own work, we thought we like that work very much, but we like to be a kind of partner to that. How can we increase the agency of the designer and thereby also increase the agency of buildings so people actually live in them? By going for policy kind of top level, we try and see, can you do built examples, right? And the idea being that you don't, maybe the laws of the universe aren't kind of from some centralized on high force, maybe it just emerges, right, from kind of little interactions between things. So we thought, well, how can you begin to, through design, really focus on the agency of people who are actually going to live there, and what can you possibly do? And there's a long history of architects dealing with that, right? Be it Florian Bagel, who was here, who actually worked for, a very kind of international people. So that's kind of where we were coming from. And I guess to state the obvious, the reason being is because the building industry, like every other in industry, but it feels particularly acute in buildings, it's people's homes where they work, has become over-financialized, whereby the built object is actually a kind of instrument for a kind of abstract exchange that happens sometimes hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, right? So in that context, where everything is set from a distance, the DNA of how things get created and put together, how can you operate in that extremely tight space to try and fight this feeling of apathy, let's say, right, and toward agency. So that gives a bit of background. Does that make sense so far? Okay, good. So we were inspired by fighting apathy, is what I'm saying. So we're interested in agency. So agency through inheriting properties of objects and spaces, new models. We're effectively interested. And so we're interested, one, in the agency of the people who actually, or beings that use and live in the buildings. And I think to do that, the agency of the architect, which is being eroded enormously, has to be reclaimed, right? Or so we thought, right? So we're always struck by, and it's just a small thought to kind of set it in motion, that we live in a highly kind of institutionalized, instructive world, right? So the double yellow line, which is a kind of peculiar British thing, is intriguing to us because double yellow lines, if you look at the history of them, they were kind of created at a certain point. Later on, the kind of single dotted white lines were created. So now we have a system where it tells you where you can park and where you can't park, right? And this kind of over directed, too much use of signifying to tell you what you can and can't do is pretty non-intuitive, right? We're always kind of interested in, can agency come with a sense of an objective space being intuitive? So I'm going to touch very briefly on two projects that we did quite a while ago now. And the reason being is because we have won some of these kind of high street fund projects which are funded by the mayor, and it was in a context of austerity. And there's something slightly sad about these projects in as much that charities were being set up to try and provide community spaces in communities where those have been eroded away to nothing. But we're interested nevertheless in working with these charities to find new kind of models and typology of social provision. We're also interested in what's the architecture that goes along with it. And at the time, it's like, I guess, 14 years ago, you could say there was an emergence of a kind of austerity architecture, which means it looks cheap, right? It looks cheap and it's kind of for temporary use and it's notionally for social use. And which was the idea, well, actually, how can architecture, in the sense of being generous and rich, actually be provided within that extremely constrained context? So we did. We worked with Create London and some other organisations to bring a library back to life as a community centre with artist studios that funds the community offer. It's in Manor Park, this kind of incredible high street, very old-fashioned London high street in the sense that it's almost entirely independent shops, except I think 2 gambling shops, and you can buy everything there. Literally, you don't need to leave the high street. And on this high street, they have a library, a new library, which looks like this, which I think is extremely depressing. It's kind of this the kind of thing that the world makes, right? Like we're doing a new library, so this is the kind of baseline that emerges. Things like this you could talk about endlessly, but I think that we need to see what the issues are. And so the old library that they had, it's about 200 meters away, was an old Edwardian Carnegie Mellon library, i.e. a gift to the community. But this, after many decades of, should we say, micro decisions going wrong and clashing with each other, meant that the building was no longer manageable for the council. So they shut it, and they got a new library because it turned out to be cheaper to build this. Supposedly, it's cheaper to do this than look after this building and refurbish it. So this charity's got hold of it under the understanding that they would provide community space in the front with English classes, after school clubs and things like that, and the rest of the building would be studios. When we looked at the budget, which was that sort of horror show budget, we sort of decided that we kind of had to become the contractors because there was no way to actually handle that situation. I think, like for instance, in Belgium, if you're going to practice as an architect, you can't be a contractor as well, right? In the UK, it's a bit wide. You do whatever you want, but it became a kind of strategy of one. How can architects claim some? I'm not saying architects should become contractors, but embedded in that is the idea of controlling costs, controlling quality. How can architects extend what they do into realms that maybe have been lost in many cases? For instance, this, right? So when we came to the place, it looks kind of okay in this photo, but there were mushy floors and there was a very strong damp smell. The electrics weren't working. We went through the archives and discovered that it used to have this timber glass architecture, also these kind of partitions in several key places through the building, which were later taken out. We found these kind of rooms that were, the floor would actually change, like be soft, like your foot would give way. And so we came up with this approach whereby we called it dematerialization, meaning that we take things away as a way to preserve the building. And we did it ourselves. I mean, we kind of hired professionals, but we were managing the contract. But we found in this particular context, a very short, sharp, low-budget project, how could you possibly guarantee architecture for the local community? We can unpick what that might mean later, but we think that architecture is a kind of ethical practice, and it does have something to do with respect for the public. So here you can see a little bit the quality of the building, the condition it was in, and we transformed it into this. We removed a lot of the floors and put cheap new floors in. We inserted this kind of new timber and glass architecture, somewhere between furniture and architecture. It became a kind of matrix of rooms. We gave it new lighting, and it got soon adopted, very well adopted since. The front room gets used for after-school clubs and kind of local political meetings, but also it's where after party used to meet and a few kind of very interesting groups used it as their kind of meeting HQ. Then another quick one before we get to the House for Artists, because that's what I'll speak about. Namely, it was extending this idea of how can you claim more, right, as a designer in this context of being very little agency. And these projects were two projects in the build-up to the House for Artists, which I think is relevant. It's in Dagenham at the Beckenham estate, which at one stage was the world's largest council estate. I'm sure you know it. It's this huge terrace and semi-development by the council or by London Corporation and then the council. And they had this, the council there, London Borough of Dagenham, had this little farmhouse, which was, some parts of the house are about 250 years old, some parts are 100, and some were a few years old. But the house was in a very bad state and was being used for a long while as an age concern headquarters locally. But it got shut down because the building was so damp, it was causing, and being so cold as a result, it became unusable for age concern, so they shut it. So there was another competition of how to bring these buildings back into use. The staircase was basically, you can't see, but from underneath it was falling to pieces. The whole plan was a mess. There's all kind of accumulations of bits and pieces over the years. On the right, you see some of the molds. It's very confusing plan. And then on the outside of the building, they have this cement render encasing the whole fabric. And then at this stage, the building was going to be run, the contract was going to be run by the council to contractors, and they did a kind of workshop with contractors, and some of them, and they were good contractors, but these contractors were suggesting that the damp couldn't really be solved. You could try it out, but then you had to put some kind of injection into the lower part of the wall to deal with the moisture, which actually wasn't going to address the real topic, and that was going to eat about a third of the budget. So we proposed to council actually we take on the contract to be the contractor, and we'll find a different way of dealing with the damp and moisture, which we basically look carefully with our environmental engineers what was actually causing this building to be so dangerously damp. It's because there was a non-breathable render, i.e. cement, which was holding onto water, and then the inner layers, sort of several layers of kind of modern construction build up, were holding on to this incredible amount of moisture. And we didn't have money to take the render off the outside, because taking it off was quite high risk because we didn't know whether the point would survive, and it'd be very expensive to do that. What we could do though is we could strip the interior and let it breathe and dry inwards. So it's the opposite to what you would typically do. And then the idea is in the future, which hasn't happened yet, once you have the budget, the capital, you would strip the outside of the breathable render off, right? So the red is this kind of cement render, and then for now we strip the inside, let it dry out, and then eventually, this hasn't happened, but eventually you would take the cement render off, put the kind of breathable, historic, natural building material. And the insides, I've not really showed the project, but it really became a very functional place. It really stays sufficiently warm, it's definitely dry, but we're kind of intrigued by this idea that how could the building physics be a thing that is something that drives the project? Again, I think architects claiming realms outside of just 1 to 500 massing and pilasters to go into understanding how physics really works. Okay, so those two buildings were sort of experiments dealing with contracts, dealing with budgets, dealing with building physics. I didn't show the actual plans, but dealing actually fundamentally with what kind of relations become possible between people under certain plan ideas, but those are all investigated in more detail in this project, the House for Artists. So it was a competition specifically for housing artists and making a community centre, but we wanted to add to it that it should address somehow some of the issues of contemporary housing in the UK, right? And that is a context that can easily cause some serious not knowing where to go, right? So why Britain's new homes so badly built, our new building nightmares, when new homes dozens of defects, fire danger, flat odours, Britain's houses being smaller since the 70s, excess deaths. There's a quote here, which is actually from 2017, so a good few years before the 2022 heat wave. My flat has reached 47.4 degrees recently. The bedroom temperature rarely drops below 29 degrees or more nights, and often remains in 30s throughout the night. And so what it means is that there are a terrific number of new builds being built in the UK that are becoming so uncomfortable and so uninhabitable that new regulations have to be created by Part O, right? So all these kind of things, there's a good 20 years of building, I would argue, which has resulted in Part 1 being necessary. There's a kind of absurdity whereby if people are designing buildings which are supposed to give you a more comfortable environment than the outside, actually we're building buildings that are less comfortable than you, right? So this is a kind of disaster. There's also parallel problems around social relations, right? Particularly if properties are seen as either an investment for the people who live in the unit, let's say, or unit investment for people who don't live in it, but that gives a very particular set of spatial relations between people. And of course, at the same time, there's these incredible figures whereby the CEO of a top housing firm might get paid 120 million bonus on top of their wages. So this kind of horrific kind of mismatch, right? So the housing emergency, as it's increasingly being called, it's a failure on every single level. It's not just how it's financed, not just how it's land, it's also a design problem, right? And the central part of the typology of housing that dominates in new builds, housing UK today, comes from this diagram in part B from the approved documents. And this gets rolled out again and again and again. It happens to not be the only way to do it. If you turn on to the next page, there is another solution, but actually you don't need to use any of those solutions. You just have to design something FISIC. But this is very convenient, this diagram, because it fits exactly the model of over-financialized housing. Right? You put as many units as possible per core, single aspect. And this diagram itself, we feel, contributes to to the production of more buildings like this, right? Because the developer will be able to say, look, this is what the regulations look like. They're not really regulations, it's approved documents, it's two different things. And so it kind of propagates the problem. I remember when I was studying, I mean, it's changed now because the housing crisis has become more of a middle class problem, which is why people write about it more. When I was studying, it was really more a working class problem, right? But when I was studying, I remember asking, can we study housing? And I was told, no, we can't do housing because housing is boring, it's just about fire regulations and blah, blah, blah. This I found completely shocking. I think now you all do housing, that's great. Well, the consequence plan is spaces like this, which is a kind of funny in a way to see a dog, maybe a semi-natural being, walking down one of these. But if you do the work and speak to people who live in space like this, we've got some residents in the House of Artists who used to live in this building, they would say they wouldn't feel safe in these spaces, they wouldn't know it because it's so long and you don't see who's coming from where. There's a kind of inherent sense of kind of threat, which is the opposite to having a kind of neighbourly positive relationship with someone. And then this problem extends into flats where you get 2 bedrooms squeezed into 61 meters squared, which shouldn't actually be allowed. But you end up with a very complicated corridor. You do get two bathrooms, but you're really living at minimum, right? And it's completely unadaptable, right? You have zero agency. You have zero ability to, very much lower ability to form a community and social bonds, but you also have no ability to impact your home, right? You're kind of stuck with this, how bad it is. This comes again, conveniently directly from the approved documents, which is just one diagram. There are many other ways of doing it. And so we thought, how can we work within the housing delivery scheme, the kind of it's very highly constrained, very highly professionalized in terms of having lots of professions, British housing delivery, and how can within that, within the norms of regulations, within the norms of construction, with the norms of costs, norms of everything, can you change the DNA? And the first thing we thought was, well, the living room could just be on a kind of shared space, right? And that's even historically quite unusual. Quite often when you get deck access, on the deck will be a kitchen and a toilet, or kitchen and a bedroom with a smaller window. So you've got still quite a big barrier between people within the home and what they share with their neighbours. So here we thought, okay, let's take a kind of different starting point. We'll put the living room at the centre. And this is how you get to your home. You share this deck, which is both for pleasure and access. And this is your typical unit that you see from your living room. And so the ceiling continues through. That space just outside yours feels very much part of your living room. The windows open up completely so that you can, so it effectively becomes outside. In summer it is outside, right? And then there's small things like you put a column right in the middle of the door. It kind of gives you a sense of, this is a bit more esoteric, but it gives a little more sense of a kind of enclosed space. And then because of the width of the walkway, you can manage your own privacy. I remember Peter Singer said, but what about the privacy in this building? It must be horrible. And we're of the view, well, if you start with housing and have the privacy turned up to the maximum, then there's no coming back down again. Whereas if you start with something that has a social life in mind, you can always dial it back up if you want, right? So this is the neighbourhood it's in, just to touch on that a bit. Barking Dagenham, this Barking High Street, which again, it's quite an old-fashioned London High Street, in as much as it's mainly local shops, it's extremely vibrant. Yeah, I won't go into too much here, but the kind of immediate context is this housing estate designed by HMM and I think Crane Lavington, and it was it replaces a former post-war figure ground estate was deemed to have failed, was knocked down questionably, and they built these buildings, which are great, right? So that was the kind of context we found ourselves in. This is the site itself, which is where the builders had their construction offices at. And this is the building itself, the first thing you see as you come from the high street. And as you look back, and for us it was quite important that we didn't go down the road of housing has to look like housing, because there's a kind of debate in London. There's this kind of, have you ever heard this housing is not look like housing? I don't really know what it means. I think it means bricks and plasters and just something, I don't know. I'm not against that, but it's like, why do we start with that assumption? Because when we start with that assumption, it comes to the whole set of social relations. We end up recreating the idea of the home as a kind of private unit which is the idea where the kind of plan idea of kind of homes from the past is you have either a wife or a servant at home, and the man comes back and retires and is completely enclosed and separate. It's a completely kind of anti-social, anti-feminist way of conceiving space. And this one we want to say, no, we're going to say, one, the building should just appear to be a public building, and secondly, the living room is going to be the joining factor between things. It means that you can live your life according to, it's much more flexible in terms of other ways of living, right? The ground floor building is seen as a part of the street, and it's a community centre. The reason it seems part of the street is because cultural institutions always have what's called the threshold problem, which means that people who aren't so familiar with going into institutional cultural spaces they don't feel confident enough to get into the building or cross the kind of space in front of it. So here we take this basic shop. It's a shop typology, and you can see very much what's going on inside, and that's it. Yeah, so there we go. It's this kind of walkways in the sky. So this idea of it just being this kind of capturing of the street. I mean, there's lots of small things like there's this corner here, because we like architecture a lot, right? But this corner here is a kind of anti-music corner. So we try to pack everything, these kind of very sort of intensely architectural decisions, whilst framing a kind of social agenda. And the reason it being anti-music is famously muses like this kind of fancy corner, but and he did it in response to the kind of builder's corner, whereby you sort of butt join overlap two things. So here we have a kind of builder's detail, kind of butt join overlap between two metal members. The reason I want to say that is because also in architecture, it always seems to be this choice. Do you either do like social things and activism and no building, or do you do building and you make something that's civic or whatever? You know what I mean? So here's the ground floor. So it's a series of rooms. So it's a series of piers, so it's things bigger than columns. And between those piers, there's going to eventually be these little walls. So it's been used for all sorts of events, ongoing all through the week. Oh yes, I was told by the people who live in the House of Artists, please, if you turn up to one of the events, do not ask to see their flat, because they're really not happy about it. If you want to see the flat, go for open house or something, right? happening. It's great. It's been used by local beauty businesses quite a lot. This is a twice a week kind of evening games club. And this is the plan. So anything that's black or this kind of speckled is concrete, which we can talk about, and everything else is you can remove, right? So we'll come to that later. The idea being that you have this kind of external access. Every part has been tested in terms of what can it do more than just access, right? So the thing we always like is that on one of the floors in summer, one of the households has dinner in the lift lobby because it has this incredible evening sun, and which we find great. Right? Why can't the lift lobby be a beautiful place? You want to have dinner, right? As I go up through the floors, at the top left there you get a little patio, something we're interested in doing more of, this idea of a kind of collective patio space high, or a collective shared, more sidewalk outdoor space higher up in the building. So the layout adaptability is quite important in the sense that yes, you can change your life immediately, you can adapt the building however you want, but it means there's a certain adaptability to the building that the council definitely has. They have problems with buildings built 25 years ago even that they can't really use for anything other than what it was originally designed for, but then the lifespan of that use dies, and then they start with a building that they're not really sure what to do, right? So these are the walkways back and front. This is the one you can use, this one you have to keep empty. You can put plants on the other side of the rail. This is the top, this is the floor above where the dinner happens, right? You can kind of see why. We also like this one, we always tell a story because one, we like the kind of rhyme with the neighbour, this kind of walkway, but also the maintenance person is always up there having a smoke at the end of the day. It's kind of perfect, I think it's really good. I don't know if the residents like it, but I find it quite sweet that, you know, you want to actually stop there. So this is the basic unit, 70 meters squared. It feels bigger. The reason it feels bigger is because there is no corridor. The corridor gets added to the kitchen, to the living room kitchen, right? The other thing is it feels very high, and it is about this much higher than norms. But the thing you have to remember is that the reason why that wasn't an issue, how isn't that just more cost? It's not. It's the same amount as facade as when you have a typical floor height. It's just that we got rid of most of the stuff, right? So the contractor doesn't matter. The contractor's like, okay, same amount of facade, I don't care, whatever. But it does give you this kind of extra height. And this is what happens when you add a wall. And then let's go into adaptability. So these photos are taken by David Brandort, and were not that long after people moved in. But we always really liked these photos because this is a painter, and they immediately put up a picture rail, right? And of course, the other picture is trying really hard to have no details, absence of details. But we love it that someone immediately introduced the classical detail. That's a grand thought. So this room feels smaller than it is just because the windows are so big and the ceiling is high. Okay, so since if you go back now, but not at one of those events, please, you'll see that these apartments are way fuller now, way fuller. So the kitchen they get is very basic, but we didn't want to meet the London Design Guide's idea of a kitchen because that's very culturally programmed. It suggests a certain particular culture, particular way of life. So we want to have it more open-ended. And I'll talk about this document. This addresses the kitchen. But one thing we did is we made for the residents a handbook of what their apartment is made from, so they know where's what, right? What you can join to, what you can't. One thing we haven't done, we wanted to do, is we wanted to make a sort of kind of a website which just has this PDF on it forever, you know, so you can always go and find the thing, right? And then the residents asked us, oh, could you just do us some drawings of some kitchens because we don't know. So we did it, and most of them have done completely other things. But what I like is they got some confidence from it, kind of. We also love this photo. This is from one of the residents where it's a father and daughter doing some maintenance that was seen as significant enough that you actually send it somewhere, right? And maintenance is famously the thing that gets hidden, done by working class people or women historically, and it gets really put in the background. And yet maintenance is the thing that we can't operate without. But we love this idea that the maintenance of a building becomes easy, potentially pleasurable at times. We're also intrigued that the council themselves, we will say this, but the council themselves have said that the building is a kind of maintenance dream. So that's the kind of thing that floats our boat, sick kind of stuff. So this is what I guess you call the co-housing floor, and there's an enfilade of windows and doors that connect them up. And again, I was saying earlier about this Neave corner, we don't think extremely architectural things and having a social gender are independent. They can actually go together. So the idea of the enfilade, very kind of refined architectural idea, can actually work very well for co-housing. In our view, it works better because one of the problems with co-housing is there's no way to stop sharing, right? So you have your bedroom and you share this and share this. Whereas here, the slam of two doors, you can go back to completely conventional life, right? And we like that kind of ability to choose. There's a sort of famous misunderstanding about the difference between property and personal possessions, right? I think co-housing sometimes gets that wrong because it can't quite understand where it sits. But we'll come back to that. So this is, I don't know whose photograph this is, but I assume it's yours. And this this co-housing, we use the word co-housing, but it's sort of less important because one of the things we discussed in the with councils over the years is they always have this problem that they have to build speculatively for people, not in terms of speculation, financial, but they have to build for people they don't know it's for, and they want to build, 4, 5, 6 bedroom places because they know they're going to get that family, but they can't build it because they don't know when that person's going to arrive, right? So it intrigues this idea that could you have an adaptable floor plan that is completely free to adapt after it's completed, as i.e. you don't need to decide who is going in the units before, or you don't need to decide the layout and the connections before you know who's going in. This is kind of idea of scenario-based design, where we try and make sure that we've tested things for various types of use, rather than just housing. So not just getting from the streets to your front door to your living room. How each space you come across can handle multiple different futures. It's not because we think it only succeeds if that future happens. It's just that you proportion the rooms and you put the door in a location that allows multiple furniture layouts. So quite often in housing, even it's like very good architects, there'll be rooms in British housing where the room can only be laid out in one way, like a living room. I don't blame the architects, it's the conditions under which they have to live. These are sections, so what is black is concrete. It's concrete exoskeleton, then a thermal line, and then a concrete inner structure. This is one of the rooms that you can actually potentially insert a floor in. It's huge. You can't actually tell how big it is, but a person is about, their head would be here, so it's enormous. And the idea being that we were saying, look, why don't we test different ways of having adaptability? One be it through, you can add and take away walls, one is that you can add floors, one is that you can join apartments, right? Yeah, some nice moments along the way that we like. Yeah, so this is important going, so here's the two diagonals. I don't know if you can see it. If you see the back, there's these two diagonals. And this is so basic, but it's just, one is, the more shallow one is winter, sun, 21st December, and the steeper one is 21st of June. And it's just where the light hits, right? And through that simple mechanism, it meant that on the 22-degree day, the apartments were about 26, 28 degrees.
39-degree day.
39 degree day. Well, I got out by 1 degree. Yeah. I knew this. I told you. But it's such a simple thing, but it makes such a big difference. Which is why I mean, I don't think it's called IDA. It's called IDS anymore. Does that still exist?
IDA we talked about it years ago.
Yeah, does IDS still exist? Do you have an IDS still? Okay, so we call this an IDS building because somehow you can describe it in every category in a lot of detail so that it performs. So there's the on-flood.
That's my one.
That's your one. This is the 12th of December. So it really does come in. And there, that's a still for an iPhone. You can see that the light is just hitting that line. And just that, simple thing as that will make the... So we're interested in this idea, do you know the book Thermal Delight? Yeah, so we're very interested in this idea about thermal delight. I mean, it can't be that we do 1 to 500 massing, then we squeeze some plans in, and then we get some engineers to sort of make it kind of work, right? I think ideas of like basic bodily pleasure can lead design work. So these are so this idea that this basic unit, the central members unit, can easily be used for other things. It's actually the perfect size for a classroom, for instance, right? And again, it made a little bit of an impact in terms of how we proportion these things, but it did make an impact in terms of when you're testing this thing again and again, how can you make it both specific and robust to being able to handle the unknown? So artists have started making artworks in relation to it, but I won't go to it now. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.